I immigrated to the United States from Russia 10 years ago, but before that, I was a truck driver. I often drove the route with the seemingly innocuous name of the M56, a road that Stalin had built with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. They were people the state had, in effect, condemned to death, and the state didn't want them back. About half of them died. They froze to death, starved and collapsed from exhaustion. And to this day, many drivers swear they see ghosts on the M56. Traveling up on the M56, I would come to the Coloma Highway, which translated means the Road of Bones. It isn't a metaphor. When the Gulag prisoners died constructing these roads, they wouldn't bury their bodies due to the permafrost making the ground too hard. So the prisoners' bones were mixed in with the road and covered over. The road itself literally has the bones of many tens of thousands of people mixed in. To call the M56 or the Road of Bones roads gives the wrong impression, at least on the last time that I drove the route back in 2010. It isn't a paved road, but covered in stones laid thickly over the Siberian dirt that turns into quicksand when it rains. The M56 runs straight north into Siberia, and there are still countless deaths on this road. It often washes out and portions of the road would just collapse. Massive dust storms sweep across it, causing collisions and deaths as trucks and cars swerved into trees or passed into the other side of the road. And my cargo was entirely uninsured. I drove with tons of beer and glass bottles in the back, some of which ended up shattering from the endless vibrations of driving over the sharp rocks all over the road, which also ended up slicing up my tires. I would go through over 15 tires a month, sometimes 25. Take a truck loaded with between 15 to 18 tons of beer and blow out a tire, and you could be sitting on an instantaneous fatal crash waiting to happen. All down the M56, you would see thousands and thousands of discarded tires on the sides of the road. As for the beer, the people living in northern Siberia loved beer. I think they drank it more than water. And beer is more popular there than vodka, despite the fact that it's Russia. Maybe beer is cheaper than bottled water. In some places it is. The story of my encounter on the M56 started before I had stopped at the warehouse dock to load up 15 tons of beer in my aging second-hand Japanese truck. It started when I saw a man standing outside just staring at me. He had very dark eyes and a round Siberian face with ruddy cheeks. He wore a fur jacket, but I couldn't tell which animal that it had come from. He looked bundled up, with sweaters and multiple layers of pants. The fur coat also included a hood, which still had the face of the animal attached, though flattened and distorted. I immediately recognized that it had come from a brown bear. I got out of my truck, lighting up a cigarette, and I started walking in his direction, pulling my jacket closed and putting a thick woolen hat on my head. The wind whipped crazily all around me, sending the snow sideways and directly into my face. I cursed, trying to turn my head. The front door stood just beside the strange man, and I needed to go inside. Might as well start the paperwork now, I figured. The man just kept staring, however, even as I got near. I was about to ask if he had a problem when he started speaking. "You are going on Colma, the Road of Bones?" he asked. "Yeah, I take the M56 north first," I said. "That's my job. I travel here and I travel there. As long as most of the cargo doesn't get broken or fall off the truck, I make a decent living." "You should not go alone," he said. "The Road of Bones will break you, it will crush you, as it crushed the bones of those who built it. You will not survive this journey, my friend, not alone." I laughed, but a chill ran down my spine. What are you, some kind of Siberian shaman? I asked. He smiled but said nothing. Are you a psychic, friend? Do you tell me my future? I only tell the truth, he said. No more and no less. Many thought that they would survive the road of bones. Most still lay there, skulls eternally grinning under the wheels that pass over them. So what are you asking me? I said. I'm not asking you anything, he said. But if you want any chance to survive, I should come with you. I will travel with you to Magadan, at the end of the road of bones, and then you will be free. You will have seen the true nature of the road of bones and maybe you'll be alive. I squinted at the man, wondering if I was talking to a madman or a drunkard, but he seemed completely coherent and logical. I wondered if maybe this was just the strangest hitchhiking ruse that anybody had ever dreamed up. I stepped back, feeling cold. The smell of fumes from the other trucks pulling into the warehouse parking lot mixed with the scent of the evergreens that surrounded us here at the edge of town. What's your name? I asked him, looking closer at the skin of his fur coat. It looked like a bear. It felt too hot standing next to the heat of the warehouse to be wearing fur. Yakov, he said. In my town, they call me Yakov the Seer. I suppressed a slight smile at this. Yakov, my name is Nikolai. Yes, I am a truck driver. Why do you not just ask me for a ride? Because I want you to prepare yourself, he said cryptically. And then he would say nothing else on the subject, but simply told me that he would come back once my cargo had been loaded. I smiled and shook his hand, but as I walked away, I felt him staring at my back. And goosebumps rose on my arms and legs, and I wondered whether I had made the right call. Soon the truck was loaded and I was ready to leave the lot. I stood in front of the door and I looked around for Yakov, but the thick snow obscured my vision. I couldn't see farther than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. Shrugging, I pulled myself into the driver's seat and pulled the door closed. The warm air from the truck made my tingling toes and fingers warm up. I took off my snow-covered jacket and hat. The smell of wet wool still reminds me of winter to this day. And then there was a sudden rapping at my window. I jumped, reaching under my seat for my P96 pistol, which I always kept loaded and hidden in case of bandits. But as I looked, I saw Yakov's round, serious face looking in at me. I sighed, motioning for him to go around and get in. Because this was an old Japanese truck, it meant that the driver and passenger sides were switched from typical US or Russian convention, even though I still drove on the right side of the road. Yakov had a small leather sack with him that bulged with his few possessions. He sat down and looked over at me and gave me a faint smile. Let's go, he said. We have a very long ride. Indeed we did. At least 72 hours up to Yakutsk, where I would drop off the entire load of beer, and then a trip down to Magadan, which could take another 5 days. By then I had to pick up another load in Magadan, a contract that I'd already accepted. They expected me there in 8 days, and I would have to drive perhaps 17 or 18 hours a day to make it in time. I set off slowly, the wind howling outside and the snow quickly covering the windshield. As I puttered down the paved road and towards the M56, Yakov told me a story. I used to be a driver on the M56 as well. One time, I had a load of vodka to transport to Yakutsk. It was summer. Dust blew so thickly across the road that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was afraid that I would go off the road and flip the truck. Night had started to fall, so I pulled over on the side of the road and I fell asleep. I awoke to a tapping on the door. I looked up and no one stood there. I wondered if it was a trick. Bandits are known to rob truckers along these roads, as you know, and sometimes they even block the road with disabled vehicles to force the trucker to stop. Then they come out drunk and armed and steal whatever he's transporting. I nodded. I had heard so many stories. I had an old Makarov pistol. Must have been from the time of Stalin himself, he laughed. But I'll tell you, it was a good gun. As long as you cleaned it and take care of it, it would last a long time. Just like the AK-47, cheap and durable. I grabbed my gun and a flashlight and began to shine the light out the windows. The dust had greatly receded and now I could see at least 30 or 40 feet in every direction. To my amazement, I saw people working in the middle of the night, but they looked strange and ethereal. They dug at the road with their hands, using half-broken shovels and rocks and ancient, rusted wheelbarrows to move the dirt. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was dreaming. I saw the identification sewn into the back of their jackets, a series of numbers that would replace that person's name, as they used to do in the gulags. I started my truck intending to get the heck out of there, and as soon as the engine made a noise, they all turned to look at me. They had woolen caps and thinly padded jackets with holes in their pants. None of them wore gloves. They shivered, trembling even though it was warm out at the time. And then I noticed the horrific wounds that each of them had. Many had gunshot wounds to the head, while others had crushed arms or hands. Each of them looked like a skeleton, starved nearly to death. They were all dead, they had to be. I drove forwards, hoping that they would move out of the way, but they didn't. Very slowly, I drove towards one of the men in the group, one whose face had been destroyed by a gunshot wound, turned into a mask of bone splinters. He just stared up at me as I approached. I kept moving forward slowly as I passed right through him. By the time that I had gotten a few dozen feet up, I turned around and saw that they were all gone. We had come onto the M56 by this point, and the whole truck vibrated horribly, shaking on the loose dirt and stones that comprised the road. I looked over at Yakov for a moment, wondering if he was pulling my leg. "Haven't you ever seen anything?" he asked me. "Well, I have, but not ghosts," I said. "Not the ghosts of Stalinism." I opened a fresh packet of cigarettes, taking one out and lighting it. I rolled down the window slightly. The bitterly cold wind began to whip into the truck, raising goosebumps all over my body. A cold wave of dread went down my spine, but for another reason, I didn't want to think of the story, and yet I told it anyway. It was winter, very cold just like now. I was driving down the M56 and found a car on the side of the road. Its hazards were on and its engine was not running. We never turn off our engines here in the winter because they won't start again in the freezing cold. Not at -60 or -70 with the wind chill. I instantly knew that the driver was in trouble. I pulled the truck over and got out. I examined the car and saw that the windows were smashed, shards of broken glass all over the seats and floor. And the driver's seat, it looked like it was covered in blood. And yet, no driver. I checked under the car and looked in the nearby forest, shining my flashlight through the trees. I called out for the driver, asking if he was hurt. For a long moment, no one answered me, and then I heard it. An answer, very faint but with each of the words still recognizable. "Please," it said, "I'm hurt. Come deeper into the woods and help me." Its voice did not sound normal. At first I wondered if it was just the voice of an injured man, but it had a hissing quality, a low, gurgling tone. I tried to think fast and simply called out a question. "Did you get in a car crash?" I asked. "What happened?" The voice came back again after a few long seconds of silence, and it just said the same thing in the same identical cadence and speed, as if a recording played in the woods on repeat. At that point, I decided that I would leave immediately. Something felt wrong with the situation. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my intuition screamed at me that something didn't add up. I turned to go, and on the other side of the road I saw, well, something. I'm not sure what it was. It was like a man but hairless. Its skin shrunken and pale, totally bleached white against its bones. It looked starved, its knees knobby, its legs just consisting of bones wrapped with skin like white sticks. Standing there totally naked without any sex organs, without eyebrows, its nose and ears missing. I wondered if it was a human at all. Now looking back on it, I know that it was not. Its eyes looked like shining orbs of pure blackness, huge pools of liquid black that stared at me, unblinking. And then it opened its mouth, showing many twisted and crooked yellow teeth. "Please, I'm hurt," it said, never changing its expression. It sounded like a recording, and I heard the same words behind me coming from the forest. "Please," another one said, maybe only 10 feet behind me from the sound. I ran towards my truck and I heard footsteps behind me, at least 2 pairs and maybe more. I didn't look back. I ran for my life and flung open the door. Just as I was closing it, a hand grabbed my leg. I shrieked, trying over and over again to close the door. I kept slamming against the thin, long white hand that had me. Eventually it let go, and I threw the truck into gear and got out of there. When I looked back, I saw dozens of pairs of black eyes staring at me, unblinking. After we had told our stories, I drove on in silence for an hour, only the soft pattering of snow against the truck breaking the monotony. I considered putting on some music but then decided against it. Yakov broke the silence after what felt like a very long time. "My grandfather died here, you know," he said. "The M56. He died building it. Sent to the gulags because one of his neighbors had a grudge against him over a land dispute. His neighbor went to the secret police and told them my grandfather was hoarding food, and it said that Stalin should be killed. Of course, none of that was true, but during those days, a grudge was good enough to guarantee you a death sentence. I remember them coming at night, 2 men in long black overcoats with bowler hats on their heads, fashionably angled to the left. They barely spoke. My grandfather answered the door. They said they had a few words for him, and then he was gone. I was in the kitchen with my grandmother, and by the time that I left, I only found an open door in the autumn night outside. I looked around, hoping to see my grandfather just smoking his pipe or sitting out on the porch, but I never saw him again. We never got his body back, and I only found out that he had died because of one of his fellow prisoners ended up surviving. He lived in the same town as me, and when he came back after 5 years in the gulags, he told me that my grandfather would never return. He told me that he had a message for me, that my grandfather loved me, he would always be with me, and that I should be strong. I cried for a long time. The townsman said my grandfather had collapsed one day while working in the winter, his body unable to deal with the constant sub-zero temperatures and starvation anymore. A guard came over and shot him dead in the head, and then they kept on building the road, throwing dirt and stones over his body. Soon the townsman said that he was buried under the road, next to a dozen other bodies that had died during work that day. I think maybe that's why the ghost had called out to me here. I never wanted to work as a driver on this road, but this is the only road leading north to Yakutsk, and I had very few other job options. Yet knowing that I drove over my grandfather's body every time that I drove the truck made me want to, I don't know, get revenge or even destroy the road itself. I just don't know. He stopped. My heart was racing and I wondered how much he knew about me. Strangely enough, my grandfather had also been in the gulags, but not as a prisoner. He had guarded them and likely shot them and tortured them as well, like all of the guards in that place. I never knew my grandfather, and he died of a heart attack before I was born, and yet I shared the same last name, and my parents even said that I looked just like him, with gray eyes, high cheekbones, and thick wavy black hair. I had a narrow and angular face and a thin muscular body, the same build as him as well. I was told that we could have been twins. I looked in the rearview mirror, seeing my own face and the face of my own grandfather, like another face glimpsed behind a mask. I saw headlights approaching behind us. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming that it was just another driver on his way to deliver goods. But they drove far too fast for the conditions. With the snow, the rocks, and the unstable nature of the road itself, I felt a sense of unease at the dangerous speed at which the driver had approached. I changed the subject quickly, not wanting to talk about my family's past. "I think we're being followed," I said. Yakov spun his head, his eyes widening as he stared at the twin beams behind us. "They're going far too fast," he said, and then I saw it. Ahead of us was a totaled car, a rusted heap of metal without windows. The front driver's side looked smashed in as if it hit a tree or a large stone. The snow had already filled the interior, covering the seats and upholstery, and I barely saw it in time. I immediately started slowing down, knowing that a truck loaded with this much weight would take much longer than a usual car to stop. "Someone rolled this out here," I said. "I think this is an ambush." Just saying the words made my breath stop. I quickly tried to calculate our odds. I was grateful that I had Yakov and that he was armed. I reached under my seat and pulled out my pistol. "Do you have any weapons?" By now the headlights had gone from pinpricks to dull moon-like orbs in the snow, and I was rapidly slowing the truck so I wouldn't hit the car barricaded across the road, trying to keep moving so that I wouldn't slide off the road. Yakov quickly undid his bulging pack and reached through, looking for something and then frowning. And then he smiled, pulling his hand up and showing me a Makarov pistol. "I thought you said that you had a Makarov," I said. "Okay, whatever, I don't care." I looked closer at it. It was one of the oldest guns that I had ever seen, outside of a museum or a collection. The Makarov came to somewhat of a point near the barrel, narrowing in a curve at the end. It had a wooden hand grip, deeply worn by handling over the decades, and the metal had tarnished and turned a dark color. But as a whole, it still looked like a beautiful gun and an antique for sure. I wondered whether it actually fired. This gun from maybe 70 or 80 years ago. I hoped for our sake that it did. The lights had nearly reached us by now, and I had managed to stop the truck fully about 30 feet away from the barricaded car. It was the farthest away that I could manage under the conditions. I wanted room to back up or turn around or to accelerate and run over bandits if it came to that. I could probably smash the car out of the way of my truck if it were life or death. At least, so I hoped at the time. Looking back now, all these years later, I realize how naive I was at that moment. I saw men approaching out of the woods, hooded and covered from head to toe in black. Each had guns. The truck behind us had stopped. I saw a Toyota pickup truck extremely old and rusted. I saw that it had 3 sets of tires, 2 in the back, a dually. It looked modified as many cars in Russia are. Yet with 6 tires and no load to carry, it could move across the M56 at a speed greater than my own. I certainly could not run it unless I shot 1 or 2 of the tires out and slowed them down enough for me to find help. This area was deserted, but there were very small towns of nomads or natives in the region. 4 men got out of the pickup truck, each carrying a rifle. We were hopelessly outmatched here. I wondered if we would die. I doubted it, but really, what did I know about bandits? Perhaps our bones would simply join the hundreds of thousands of others who had died here. Perhaps they too would become a part of the road. "Get out!" The man in front screamed at us. Covered in a ski mask, I could only see his eyes, but they looked bleary and unfocused. His gaze kept flickering from us to the woods, and then around the area, and then returned back to me. I wondered if these men were all drunk. Very likely. If so, it may be easier to fight them off. I looked over at Yakov, who sat in his seat, trembling slightly, the gun in his hand. He looked at me, and I could see the terror that I felt reflected in his eyes. "Should we fight?" he asked desperately. I had no idea. This had never happened before. I had only heard stories, but... "Get out now or we shoot." The man screamed at us, breaking my thoughts. "Yes, we must fight," I said softly, as if the man outside could hear me. "They might kill us anyway. I'm not taking that chance. At least if we fight, we might be able to keep our fates in our hands alone. These men are likely drunk and not very accurate with their guns. We might have the advantage there." I looked over at the man in front, seeing him raise his gun and aim it at me. I ducked down, and a minute later, a bullet flew through the driver's side door. The crack of it shattered the otherwise muffled sounds of the blizzard. I felt cold air rush into the car through the hole. I rolled down my window while still ducking down on my seat, praying to God for help. I saw Yakov duck down as well, shaking like a leaf, his hands trembling badly. I sat up quickly, aiming and firing at the man in front. He stood there, his gun pointed down, talking to the other man. The shot hit him in the chest and he dropped, screaming. I saw splatters of blood and the pure white snow around him, little islands of red in an eternally white landscape. Shooting a gun in such a confined space made my ears ring, and for a moment I couldn't hear anything. I saw that the rest of the men had met in a circle when I shot him, both the ones from the forest and the ones from the pickup truck. It would make it easier to pick them all off one by one, or so I hoped anyway. I counted 7 more men to kill or disable, yet I hoped that if I killed a few, the rest would flee. They wanted easy targets and quick money, not men with guns who shot back. They all raised their guns to fire into the truck, swearing at us and yelling for us to surrender or die, when a shrill, ear-splitting sound suddenly came out of the forest. They looked away, their guns still pointed at us, their fingers on the triggers. I heard them babbling to each other in panicked, low voices, and they all began to run in unison back towards their pickup truck. They didn't even give us a backwards glance, or try to grab the body of their fallen comrade. They ran for their lives as if they had heard that sound before and they knew exactly what it was. I had no idea, however. I thought some strange Siberian animal would come flying out of the woods, some species that I had never seen before. But this seemed far better than a group of armed men. "Oh, thank God," I said. "They're leaving. Now we just need to push this car out of the road and we can get the heck out of here." Yakov nodded, still looking nervous and still holding his gun tightly. "What do you think that was?" he asked. I shrugged, apathetic. Probably just an animal," I said. "These people around here, they're superstitious. They think the boogeyman is." But at that moment I saw not a monster, but a child fleeing out of the woods. It was a little Siberian girl no more than 7 or 8, her facial features a mixture of Asian and white, reminding me of the Buryats that I had known, an ethnic minority in the region. She had a look of pure and utter terror on her face that told me that this was no animal chasing her. I quickly opened my door, running out into the freezing winter. Because this was a Japanese truck, the driver's side was on the right, making me closer to her than Yakov. "Little girl," I said, "what are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? You'll freeze to death. Were you with those men? Are they your family? Did they kidnap you?" She looked shell-shocked, her eyes widening as she saw me. "I was kidnapped, yes," she said, "but not by any man. Please, sir, get me out of here. My twin sister is still back at the hut. She needs help. That thing is going to eat her." And then she put her face against my chest and cried, "It was the Baba Yaga. She's real, please. I don't want to be eaten." I grabbed the hysterical, screaming girl by the hand and began to pull her towards the truck. At first she hesitated, and then she began to run ahead of me, flinging herself into the cab and looking back out with huge dark eyes, like a gopher peeking out of its hole. That shrill, hateful shrieking from the woods had nearly reached me by this point. I couldn't make out any words in it. It seemed like just guttural cries of fury and hunger. I began to back up towards the truck, my pistol still raised, refusing to turn my back on anything that sounded like that. And then I saw the silhouette, breaking through the trees. At first, I thought it was a polar bear, this looming shadow that snapped solid branches aside like they were twigs. But instead I saw a woman standing over 8 feet tall, with mottled gray skin and a wrinkled, gaunt face. One of her eyes looked pure white as if covered in a cataract. Her other had a strikingly pure blue iris, with a deep, large pupil staring out from the middle, roving over the landscape before focusing on me. Her nose stuck out like a beak, sharp and curving, a few inches long. On her neck I saw a necklace, holding the fingers of children, dozens of them, some rotted to bones, others fresh and still dripping blood. She saw me, looked at the gun and then at my face and smiled. "You don't need to die too, friend," she said in a sickly, choking voice. A trickle of blood coming from her mouth and rolling down her chin as she spoke. "Give me the girl and you can leave in peace. What's mine is mine." I didn't even respond but simply fired, aiming at her chest. She fell back, screaming again, and I turned and ran towards the truck, slamming the door and starting the engine. The pickup truck had gone, and I couldn't even see its lights in the distance anymore. I started to go forward, slowly pushing the car aside with my truck, yet I couldn't get it to budge more than a few inches, as it seemed to sink down into the snow. I tried reversing, but I couldn't get the momentum on the slippery ice, as the road sloped downwards at an angle towards the right side. I didn't have enough clearance to try going forwards either. I was stuck, and to make things worse, I looked outside the window and saw the Baba Yaga was gone. Only a small puddle of black blood marked the spot where she had lain. While conditions seemed bad right now with the truck stuck like it was, I gave thanks that at least the engine started without issue. At times it got so cold in Siberia that the engines would fail to start. The temperature had started to increase, however, and outside the wind had died down. The snow had stopped, and looking at the thermometer that I kept on the outside of the truck, I saw that it was only -5 degrees Fahrenheit now. I cursed, putting on many layers while I sat in the truck driver's seat, the little girl sitting between me and Yakov on an empty bucket that she had turned upside down. She didn't seem affected by the cold at all. She had probably grown up in far worse. "What are you doing?" the girl said with widening eyes, watching me. I looked at her, shaking my head. "Obviously we have to go get your sister," I said. "No," she said. "I'm not going back there, never. I will never go back to that place." She started to cry. "The legs, the fence, the ovens, the cages. You have no idea how horrible it is." "Calm down," I said. "You have to lead us back towards the hut. You probably won't have to go in. We just need to get your sister and come back, and then we can leave." "What's your name?" "Irina," she said. "That's a very pretty name," Yakov said. "My name is Yakov, and this is Nikolai. We're the good guys. We can fight off that witch and bring your sister home. If we do nothing, your sister will die. You know that." Irina nodded, wiping her eyes. Bundled up in her layers of clothing with a fur jacket on the outside, she looked almost like a little Eskimo sitting here in my truck. I repressed the crazy urge to laugh at the image, remembering what was happening. "Let's do this," I said, getting out of the truck. I grabbed more ammo from the glove box and saw Yakov grabbing some bullets from the satchel of random goods that he carried around with him in a leather skin. He left the rest of his possessions in the truck, folding the leather carefully back over them and tying it with a cord. It felt eerie, like the dawn before a major battle. I had goosebumps all over my body and not just from the cold. The idea of going up against an infamous witch, a child-eating monster, well, it didn't raise my confidence. Though this happened years ago, I still remember that terrible feeling, as if everything had been leading up to this point and now everything stood still watching. I had heard legends of Baba Yaga growing up, how Satan had taken 12 women who were murderers and criminals, thrown their bodies in a pot together, mixed it up, and came out Baba Yaga. Of course, I scoffed at such myths now that I was older, but seeing her there had made me question many things. Irina went out first, not minding the cold at all, her breath coming out in steamy plumes. Yakov and I had flashlights from the truck, jumping down behind her. Their light came out dimly, but it gave enough illumination on the white snow to see. The clouds had started to part and the moon had come out in the sky, looking down on us like a single blind eye, like the cataract-ridden eye of Baba Yaga that I had seen before. As we started walking across the M56 and into the woods, that shrill gurgling shriek came ringing out again. I knew Baba Yaga was close, likely even watching us. She might attack at any moment. We walked further down the trail, a winding deer trail only a couple of feet wide, with branches that would smack me in the face and rocks to trip over every few steps. Just as I had turned to Yakov to say that we may have lost her, she attacked. I saw a blur and then an intense pain in my side as she tackled me, knocking me quickly to the snowy ground. I kept a death grip on my gun, snacking my head against a tree trunk, and the world went white. I drifted in and out of consciousness for a few moments, or perhaps it was longer. Time got strange. As if from a great distance, I heard gunshots and more screaming, and then my vision started to return and I focused. I saw Yakov crouched on the ground, holding his left hand tightly. I saw a fountain of blood running over his gloves, staining the snow in strange droplets and splotches. I tried to sit up, but a lightning bolt of pain seared my back. I groaned, raising my hand to my head. I felt something sticky on my scalp, and pulling my hand back, I saw that it was covered in blood. It felt warm and wet, running down from the right side of my scalp and showing no signs of slowing. I felt nauseated and weak for a second, seeing all that blood, how it stained my clothes and the snow below me. I took a few deep breaths in and out, slowly concentrating and steadying myself. My hand still trembled, and my legs felt like jelly as I tried to stand, but I leaned against the tree and let the waves of weakness and nausea pass by. Yakov wasn't doing much better. He was hyperventilating, staring in shock at his spurting hand. His left thumb looked like it was mostly or entirely gone. We've got to put pressure," I said slowly, gulping air, "on the wound, and ice and snow." I began to tear a strip from one of my shirts and then walked slowly over to Yakov on unsteady legs. I looked into his eyes. They looked dark and tortured, and he quickly looked away, tears forming in his eyes from the shock and pain. Irina sat next to him on a log, and she watched in horror, looking away whenever she noticed the blood. "Let's do this," I said. "Ready?" He nodded weakly. I pulled the strip of cloth around the hole where his thumb used to, running it around his hand in circles and tightening it. He screamed. I gave him a piece of wood to bite down on, and he pulled it even tighter. I saw teeth marks forming deep in the wood. A solid branch, 1 inch in diameter, I had snapped in half. His breath came in and out so fast that I thought for sure he would pass out, but he kept with me. Soon I had pressure on the wound and the bleeding had slowed considerably. I repeated the process with my head, wrapping more strips of cloth around the bloody scalp wound and pulling. I gritted my teeth, but the pain wasn't nearly as bad as I thought, except for the crushing migraine. More than anything, I just felt weak and waves of nausea kept assailing me. Splotches would rise in my vision, black dots that seemed to precede passing out. But I would sit down quickly, and after a few minutes, I had regained most of my strength. "Let's keep going," I said weakly. Irina stood next to Yakov, looking petrified. "I don't want to go," Irina said stubbornly. "Please don't make me." "Irina," I sighed, "your sister might die if we turn around. We have no choice." "But I'm too scared," she said. "You have no idea how bad it is there. You can't even imagine." But after a few minutes of convincing, she continued to lead us. A ragtag group of injured men and a child, limping through the thick snow in the freezing cold. We walked for an hour in silence, the little girl following her tracks, looking for landmarks that she had passed when she had escaped the first time. She had grown up in the woods most likely, and her family must have taught her much. I was worried about freezing to death, but then I started to notice that my body was growing warmer. I thought perhaps it was simply the first sign of hypothermia. And yet as she walked, I noticed changes in the forest. It had actually gotten warmer. It wasn't just in my mind. Soon the snow had all gone. I looked around and noticed that all the trees were dead, their naked arms extending up to the sky. I had to take off a jacket and then a sweater too. I saw the others doing the same, sweating as it warmed up. A fog began to roll in, covering the whole area. "This is the space between the world of the living and the dead," Irina said in her sweet child's voice. It made the statement all the more horrible. "The hut is nearby. This is the border of her home." Through the mist, I swore that I could see faces appearing and disappearing, the horror-stricken visages of children and eternally grinning skulls. Soon we came to a clearing. All the trees had stopped in a large circle, a few 100 feet in diameter. In horror, I looked at what lay beyond. A fence surrounded the property made of children's bones. It extended high up at least 20 feet, countless arm and leg bones stacked on top of each other, bound together with twine and braced with more bones, attached vertically against the others. I saw no gaps bigger than an inch and no way to climb it. Looking at the top, I saw pieces of sharpened bone sticking up, like some razor wire from hell. Irina shook at my side and she grabbed my hand suddenly, her small body exuding a strength that seemed beyond her physical abilities. I smiled down at her, smoothing her long black hair with my right hand. I felt almost entirely recovered from my earlier concussion, though my head still pounded in time with the beat of my heart. I wished that I had brought some aspirin. "How do we get in?" Irina asked, taking off another sweater and hanging it over her shoulder. I had absolutely no idea. "Let's look around," I said. We began to circle the fence, walking along the circumference of the clearing. I could see a hut beyond through the small gaps. After a minute, we came to the gate and it stood 20 feet tall, like the rest of the fence, and it would be almost impossible to scale. Unlike the rest of the fence, the gate had been fashioned entirely from skulls. I saw all the small skulls stacked on top of another. As I imagined how many children had died to build just this macabre gate, a feeling of sickness and dread washed over me. Sticking out the front of it in the exact center, I saw a larger skull. It looked like that of a man. In its open mouth, I saw a silver keyhole. In anger, I tried shaking the gate, and it came swinging open, totally silent. "It's open," Yakov said, amazed. I looked at him. "This feels like a trap," I said. He nodded. Irina hid behind Yakov now, not wanting to look at the eternally grinning skull stacked in front of her. bound together with some sort of invisible glue. I looked through the gate at the hut beyond, my breath caught in my throat. It stood on two massive legs. The feet looked like those of a chicken, but the legs loomed 10 feet above the ground, where they somehow attached to the hut, holding it up suspended in the air. They were skeletal, all the flesh and muscle long ago wasted away. "Are those chicken legs?" Yakov asked, his voice low. I felt eyes on me. I looked back into the forest, but I saw no one. "Who the heck knows?" I asked. "But where do you get a chicken that's the size of an elephant, or even bigger?" "From hell?" he asked, and I laughed. "You think they have massive chickens down there just going around and pecking at all the hell grains," I said. He smiled. "I don't know, and I don't want to find out. Let's do this." We began to walk forwards into the clearing. I could see the circular hut more clearly now. An inner light burned, sending out a fiery red glow through the windows. Unlike the rest of this horrible place, it looked like the hut was actually built of wood and stone. It had a quaint look, like the hut of an ancient serf. The top of it met in a point with thatch and twigs carefully aligned to form a rounded dome. The windows were lined with stones. Trunks of dead trees formed the main construction material, pressed one against the next and stacked vertically in a perfect circle. They had their branches cut off and their bark stripped, the wood ground down to a smooth and uniform texture. "My sister is in there," Irina whispered. "Please don't make me go back. Please, you don't know what they do in there, what she does in there." I grabbed her hand. "We can't leave you behind. I think we're being watched. I'm sorry, but you have to come with us." She put her head down, looking like a beaten dog. She trudged alongside us slowly as we examined the property, but we saw no sign of anyone. I sighed deeply. "All right, let's go inside," I said. "Let's find out what horrors await us in that hut." As we walked forward, I heard the gate click close behind us. I turned and looked, but I saw no one. It seemed as if it had closed on its own. I saw to my horror that I would need a key to get out as well as in. Another skull, its mouth open and filled with a silver locking mechanism, stuck out on this side as well. The metal in its mouth made it look like it was choking, the eternally gaping mouth like it was screaming. I turned away, focusing on the task at hand, hoping I would survive the next few minutes. The space around the hut looked totally dead. I didn't see a single blade of grass or even a weed to mar the smooth, black earth. It looked so dark in the shadows of the forest that the legs in the hut seemed to hover over an abyss. The door, painted a blinding white, contrasted heavily with the rest of the stocked logs and twigs that composed the ancient-looking hut. A set of rickety wooden stairs led up to the door. I went first, and there was no railing, and with each step I took, I was afraid that it would fall right through the stairs. But they were stronger than they looked and nailed tightly to the beams underneath. Without hesitation, I flung the door open and saw a nightmare laying beyond. A child's body roasted on a spit over the raging fire in the fireplace, giving off a smell of cooking meat and wood smoke that mixed with the rosemary, parsley, and other herbs sprinkled over the body. I saw lampshades made of human skins, covering black candles that flickered and sputtered as the wind came in from outside. In the corner, a little girl crouched in a cage that was only big enough for a dog. She couldn't stand up and cried constantly. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Please help me," she screamed. "She'll be back any moment. Get me out of here." She looked like the spitting image of Irina, and I wondered if they were identical twins. Yakov grabbed a knife from his pocket, going over to the cage and looked closely at the lock. He flicked it open and began feverishly pulling at the ancient-looking padlock that held the cage closed. It didn't seem nearly as secure as a modern deadbolt, and I wondered how many years the old witch had possessed it. I walked over to the window and looked outside, and my heart jumped in my throat. Outside, I saw Baba Yaga getting out of what looked like a flying pestle as it slowly lowered itself toward the ground. It stood about 4 feet tall, enough to hide Irina inside it if it came to it. The wood looked beautiful, like smooth mahogany, perfectly fit together without cracks or gaps of any kind. It had strange runes burnt into the exterior. The writing was not Russian or any Slavic language that I knew. She had a mortar as tall as herself. She had her hands wrapped around the dark wood of the mortar, using the flaring wide end of the bottom to push herself up and over the wall of the pestle. She had extremely thin legs like those of a skeleton. They looked like 2 iron bars wrapped in skin. I looked close through the window, squinting to try to make out every detail. I wondered if she used that mortar and pestle to grind up the bodies of children, to prepare their bodies for a meal. I saw dark stains on the bottom of the mortar, dark red and soaked deeply into the wood. I figured that answered my question. She put the mortar back inside and then turned and looked directly inside the hut. Her eyes met mine, one blind and staring, one filled with intelligence and fury. I ducked away, hoping that she hadn't seen me. Hurry up, I said, turning to go help Irina and Yakov. She's coming, she's got a flying barrel too. I saw they nearly had the lock broken by this point. It was fairly flimsy and ancient looking, and Yakov had a folding knife which he used to pry it loose. Realizing there was nothing that I could do to speed up the process, I ran back towards the window. Baba Yaga was gone. She wasn't standing next to her mortar and pestle anymore. In fact, her mortar and pestle were gone too. A moment later, a deafening cacophony exploded across the hut as the roof collapsed inwards, covering us with thin branches, thatch, and straw. I found myself on the floor, unable to remember where I was for a moment. The cold steel of the gun was still gripped tightly in my hand, and then I heard crying and screaming, and it all came rushing back to me. I pushed some boards off of myself, feeling blood run down over my forehead. I felt weak. The fireplace on the other side of the room gave off some light. I saw the ceiling had collapsed, and as I looked up, I saw the full moon illuminating the cracked and ragged edges of the ruined roof. A gunshot rang out very close by, and I heard a guttural cry of pain and surprise. I ran towards the sound, and after pushing a few beams from a section of collapsed wall to the side, I made a path towards Yakov and Baba Yaga. Yakov stood only a few feet away and had just shot her in the neck at point-blank range. Thick black blood ran down her tattered rags of clothing, staining the coarse brown cloth and making it cling to her skin. She screamed in rage, opening her mouth wide and showing many sharp yellow teeth, running forwards towards him and tackling him. I pushed some more rubble out of the way and ran forwards, the gun still clenched in my hand. Baba Yaga used her shark-like teeth to bite Yakov over and over in a space of mere seconds. He squealed like a pig being slaughtered, an inhuman wail that made me want to cover my ears and look away. Without thinking, I raised the gun and fired. The shot hit her in the shoulder and came out of her chest. With a grunt, she fell sideways onto the ruined floor. I saw with horror that the wound in her neck was stitching itself closed before my eyes. Whatever dark magic had made this creature had clearly given her superhuman healing abilities. I wondered how we should kill her. If possible, whether multiple gunshots to the head would do it or not. I had a creeping suspicion that it would not be so easy. I saw Yakov writhing on the floor, his face a mess of torn flesh. His nose missing, and pieces of his cheeks, lips, and forehead had deep slices, leaving flaps of skin hanging over his face. I started to run to him, but he shook his head vigorously. "Get the girls," he said through a mouth full of blood, choking, his sounds coming out strange, maybe due to the bites that had split his lips and taken part of the top one. Instead, I began to walk over to Baba Yaga, planning to put the pistol to her head point blank and pull the trigger. But the ruins of the thick hut door creaked open at that moment, and I turned, stunned at what I saw. Across the pile of torn beams and splintered boards, I saw the creatures that I had told Yakov about, the ones that I had seen next to the empty car stained with blood. They had hidden in the woods saying, "Please help me," over and over in a perfect, parrot-like fashion. And now they had come, the same pure black eyes, thin bodies and sheet white skin. They looked like cancer patients, without a shred of fat on their bodies, totally hairless and alien, lacking sex organs or nipples, ears or noses. But they were much faster than their emaciated condition would suggest, and they began to rush in, pushing some of the rubble aside and approaching where Yakov and I stood. I looked from Baba Yaga to the newcomers quickly, my mind racing. She looked up, a sensation of pain in her one good eye, the other flat and white, but her face lit up when she saw who had just arrived. "My servants, my sweet children," she said in a deep and cooing voice. "You knew your mother was in trouble and came, didn't you? You always know, always. That makes you so beautiful to me. You'll always be mine." I turned back to Baba Yaga, meaning to finish her off, but she sat up rapidly and grabbed my wrist, twisting. I cried out in pain and the gun went flying, settling under debris and rubble. I smelled smoke and to my horror, realized the fireplace had ignited some of the ruined beams. Baba Yaga pushed me back and went flying into the wall, my wrist swelling and burning. In the corner I saw Irina helping her sister out of the cage. The fire caught the old brittle wood as if it were soaked in gasoline, and I saw with horror that soon it would cut off the escape route for Irina and her sister. Groaning, I got up quickly. Yakov had reloaded and began shooting at the creatures that approached him. Baba Yaga stood up slowly, still dripping black blood on the floor, looking much weaker than before. I counted that as a blessing, though I didn't think that it would last. Whatever dark magic kept this monster alive was more powerful than a flesh wound, apparently. I had to choose between helping Irina or getting the gun, and I saw no choice. I dived into the rubble where I had last seen it, feeling splinters and nails poking into my skin. A few pierced my arms and legs through my clothing, and I felt sticky trickles of blood soaking them. I ignored the pain of my hand, the throbbing migraine that I still had from the concussion, and now this new insult to my body. The adrenaline helped, but I knew that if I survived this, I would be sore and cut for weeks. The black-eyed creatures ran at me, and one grabbed my leg as I ducked and felt around furiously in the dark for the pistol. The fire kept spreading, giving me slightly more light through the crooked beams and collapsed roof, and I saw a glint of metal in the dim illumination, just as the creatures had pulled me out. I grabbed frantically, feeling the cold grip of the gun against my hand. Turning around quickly, I fired without aiming, shooting point blank at the creatures standing there. One got hit in the chest, a splatter of the same black blood as Baba Yaga's staining the wall behind it. I missed the other one, and it lunged, snapping with its twisted yellow teeth, going straight for my throat or face. Without thinking, I fired again, and the shot went through its nose holes, disintegrating the front of its face, and sending a dark spray of blood out behind it. It fell on me. I struggled, pushing the body off. All I could smell was smoke now, and I began to choke and sputter. I looked around wildly, but the smoke had grown thick, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I looked for Irina and her sister moving towards where I had last seen them, but quickly gave up and started calling out. "Irina, get out of here now, we have to go," I said. I felt a small hand thrust into mine, and thinking that it was Irina, I pulled, running towards the door. I ran straight into Yakov, who was choking on the smoke. I looked into his eyes and gasped. His face was a mask of blood. Only 2 dark eyes peered out from the destroyed flesh below. He kept spitting blood as he coughed. Without thinking, I pushed him towards the door, continuously pulling the little girl behind me. More creatures stood there, but we shot the ones on the stairs and the others retreated away, galloping on all fours like some strange animal. They looked back with hatred, their eyes black and shining. They ran towards the gate, which was now open. I wondered if one of them had a key. Turning around, I saw the hut had turned into a blazing inferno. To my horror, I saw that I did not hold Irina's hand, but her twin sister's instead. "Where's Irina?" I asked, panicked, and then the screaming started from the hut. The floor began to collapse, chunks of molten wood falling between the dead skeletal chicken legs that held up the hut. Like something from a nightmare, I saw Baba Yaga stumbling out, her skin melting, her hair on fire, her one good eye still peering out from the mask of burning flesh. Her shrill, ear-splitting shriek echoed through the forest around us, and I heard another quieter scream start coming from the hut. It sounded like a little girl. Without thinking, I began to push Yakov and Irina's sister out of the gate, praying for Irina's safety, but knowing that the only thing she could hope for was a quick death from suffocation. No one could survive that inferno. She was right when she said that we shouldn't have come here, but I had forced her and now she was dying or dead. She ran out into the woods, following the trail back to the truck. Yakov kept stumbling and falling. "I can't go on much longer," he said. "I think I'm dying. She really did a number on me. I feel lightheaded and I think that I might pass out soon." "That's just the blood loss," I said, reassuring him but not believing it. "Once we get you to a hospital, you'll be fine. You just need a few stitches. It's not as bad as it looks." He laughed, a sarcastic and bitter sound. "Don't lie to the dying," he muttered. And just as the truck came into sight, the black-eyed creatures came galloping silently out of the woods on all fours, a dozen of them surrounding us. They didn't blink or show any emotion, but as if a signal had been given, they swarmed us all at once. I began shooting, having refilled the chamber with bullets from my pocket, but there were too many. I cleared a path towards the truck, shooting 5 in the chest and aiming for center mass. Yakov began to fire, but many of his shots missed as blood streamed over his face and eyes, and soon we were both out of bullets. I grabbed the little girl and ran towards the truck as Yakov held his place, roaring with bloodlust and excitement, pulling out a folding knife from his pocket. "Come on," he screamed, but he just smiled. "Goodbye, friend," he said as the creatures jumped on him, and he began stabbing and fighting in his last moments, cutting at their throats and faces as they ate him alive. I took Irina's sister to a hospital and told the police about everything that had happened. They looked at me like I was a madman. The little girl corroborated my story, but they just dismissed it as the imagination of a child. Nonetheless, they went out to the site and they found Yakov's body. They ruled that he had been mauled by animals. There were, after all, many bears in that area. They also followed our footsteps into the woods but said they found no hut, no fire, and no clearing. They said the footsteps just stopped suddenly, as if we had been abducted by a UFO. The hut had gone and so had Baba Yaga. After that day, I finished my drive, sold my truck, and made plans to move out of Russia forever. I had seen enough. But still, I wonder what else lies in those woods. What other secrets remain to be found?